Coming up, we have Jackson Gatlin from Locked On Rockets join us to give the definitive stance of where the Houston Rockets want their offseason to go. Yes, they're looking maybe to compete now. Sure, they have their eyes on Mikal Bridges, and maybe swapping draft picks is a part of their agenda heading towards the draft. But what about that young core? Could Brooklyn pry away some young talent to rebuild on their side? We get all the details and provide a somewhat dim view for Brooklyn Nets fans everywhere. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht. There is no Doug Norrie. We will have a Jackson Gatlin, and we still thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms, and let you know that this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And as we say, this can be a clarifying conversation when we think about what Brooklyn might be willing to do should the right offers come across the table. But a lot of times when you're looking at it from a Brooklyn perspective out, Doug and I set high bars for what it would take to get Mikal Bridges away. Sometimes the pick swaps seem oh so easy to do, and even acquiring young talent. Jackson really lays out the path here where Houston is in a pretty prime position to want to acquire talent to compete now, but also not touch that core, maybe up to 6 players who are all 22 years or younger, so that they still have a consistent future going forward. We dive into all these aspects of it, and we also let you know that the audio on my end is a little bit rough as we were in a bit of a different environment getting this one all together here. It's still an excellent conversation. We always appreciate you for bearing with us. Enjoy it as we dive in right now. All right, so obviously, Jackson, the only way to have this conversation about ultimately, from a Brooklyn Nets perspective, how we get better, how this team improves at the cost of the Houston Rockets, is for me, at least from the Nets perspective, to ask, what is Houston trying to accomplish this offseason? Because so far we've heard they'll swap Nets picks back with them for future picks from Phoenix. They want to get out of the 3rd pick overall, potentially to trade for Mikal Bridges, or maybe they just want to move back in the draft, possibly with Memphis. Is the agenda for Houston to compete right now, just to improve their long-term prospects? Like, what is the goal for this team over the course of this offseason and the upcoming draft?
Yeah, so I think first off, right, with the hiring of Ime Udoka, this team wanted to take their next step in their kind of rebuilding process, right? Last year, right after they hired Ime Udoka, they started talking about going into phase 2 of the rebuild. And I think we saw that this past season, right? They had a 19-win improvement, 41-41 on the year. They want to continue building on that success. That doesn't mean that the Rockets are necessarily in a position where they're ready to go, chips all into the center of the table and, mortgage every single asset they have under their roof to get, whatever the next star player is that's available. They still have a little bit of time to grow and nurture and develop the young talent that they do have on the roster. But they are trying to be competitive, right? And to do that, you need impactful win now players, but it's kind of that they're straddling the fence between wanting to win, but also still wanting to be able to add maybe another piece or two, another, young, talented prospect that they can maybe slow play the development of, because you look at the standings just in the Western Conference. We're not even going to pay attention to the entirety of the league. Right. Just in the Western Conference next season, you're going to have maybe 13, quite possibly 14 of the 15 teams in the West who all have playoff aspirations or who all want to be competitive. Basically everybody except for the Portland Trailblazers. So is now the time to strike, if you're the Rockets, to try and make a win now move or acquire a win now player to bolster your chances next season? Or would they be better off just kind of slow playing things, letting things develop, give it another year or two before they start, using some of those assets to pick up win now pieces that complement the players that they already have on the roster? And I think with Ime Udoka as the head coach, I think that's kind of like accelerated their timeline a little bit, right? Ime is a guy who's already been to the finals as a head coach. He was very clear about his goals for this past season for the Rockets, them wanting to make the playoffs. They fell a little bit short of that goal, but at the end of the day, that's why they're in this precarious position where, having the Nets pick jump from 9 to number 3 gives them a lot of options in this year's draft. I think if the pick had stayed where we thought it was going to be, and had they not received the lottery luck that they had, we probably wouldn't be hearing so many rumors about them wanting to trade the pick, because obviously it's easier. You have a little bit more leverage to trade the number 3 overall pick than you would if it was, down at number 9 or 10 or what have you, a little bit later in the lottery.
As we say on Locked On Nets, Doug and I, if it had been that the Nets had the pick, then obviously we would have been the worst possible lottery spot they could have landed in. Only because it conveyed to Houston does it end up being the 3rd. You also mentioned there, too, when you look at the standings, both teams finished 11th in their respective conferences, but 9 more wins for the Houston Rockets. Like, if the Brooklyn Nets had been 41-41, well, first of all, their standing would have looked a little bit shinier in the Eastern Conference. You'd be talking about still sitting there in the play-in tournament, but arguably having a season that I think Nets fans would have been satisfied with, showing some improvement. Okay, the core, the Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson is working out. The disaster that was Ben Simmons from a health perspective, maybe that goes differently. All of these factors. But both these teams, new head coach for Brooklyn now, obviously. They're going to try to go in a more positive direction. But both these teams are in precarious spots about how they move going forward. Is there any sense that Houston is taunting Brooklyn like with their own pick control here as well? 2024 aside, is the idea here maybe as well, specifically when we think about Phoenix, hey, we'll take, to your point, the longer term prospect here if we can't add players potentially, but we can maybe trade away the Brooklyn Nets picks before we worry about utilizing our own? Is there some leverage here they're trying to anchor on Brooklyn and say, hey, if you want your picks back, now is the time, because otherwise they're going somewhere else. And that team is going to be watching you now and thinking about how good those could be over 25, 26 and going forward.
Yeah, I think from the perspective about like the Suns picks, right? I think it's always, you talk about NBA draft picks as kind of the currency in the NBA. And I like to use the buying a new car analogy, right? The moment you like realize that asset, the moment that asset, you have to draft that pick and it becomes a rookie player or whatever, then it depreciates in value by whatever, 30, 50%, whatever you want to call it. So being able to kind of, I guess, kick the can down the road, if you will, if you're the Rockets, and trying to have those conversations with the Nets and say, hey, we'll give you your picks back. Just give us, some of, a little bit of access to those Suns picks, because then it would allow the Rockets a little bit more time to decide, hey, okay, well, we don't have to worry about what we're doing with these picks further down the line. We have more of a lifeline on what we're going to ultimately decide to do with these draft assets, rather than the Nets picks, which we're already seeing start to convey, right? We saw it turn into Tari Eason a couple of years ago. Right now we're seeing the number 3 overall selection, and they still have the 2025 swap next year, the 2026 unprotected, and then the 2027 swap as well. So like at the end of the day, as we keep navigating the timeline of the Rockets' control of these Nets picks, I think they're kind of losing some value, because they're going to have to figure out, okay, are we trading? Basically, when they made this James Harden trade years ago, I think they envisioned, okay, we're going to trade James Harden for all these Nets assets, and then these assets are going to be what we then down the line flip into another star player, another star deal, right? We heard some rumors about the Rockets' potential interest in pursuing Donovan Mitchell potentially, right? So the Rockets are right there with the Brooklyn Nets.
And that was the first time our ears perked up, where it was like, hey, remember? And then we say this to the Nets fan base all the time around Donovan Mitchell was, oh, well, you'll just go get him. You'll just go get him. And I was like, yep, until now, when someone starts offering all of your picks to go get Donovan Mitchell, and all of a sudden you don't have the same leverage you perceived yourself to have in an offseason.
Exactly. And I think from a leverage perspective, and this is the argument that I keep coming back to, and this is why I'm so curious your thoughts on this, Adam, is I think we have seen enough evidence in the NBA landscape over the last, however, 5, 10, 15 years that teams that I think it's very rare to find a team that doesn't bottom out completely to then rebuild themselves back up into what you hope is one day a contender, right? I think that's kind of the life cycle of the NBA. And I think it's a tried and proven like method of, hey, all right, we don't have the pieces to be a contender right now. We're going to strip it down to the nuts and bolts. We're going to be bad for a couple of years, and we're going to recoup and get those top draft assets, a lot of young talent, and we're going to hopefully have a brighter future because of it. That's exactly what the Rockets did for a few years, right? They were one of the laughing stocks of the NBA for the last 3 years. And then guess what? We saw kind of the fruits of that labor pay off this season, a 41-41 year, and a lot of hope and optimism on the horizon that they're headed the right direction with an incredibly young, talented core 6 of really exciting players. Alperen Sengun looked like, an all-star this past season. Jalen Green came on really late, but had a really strong close to his season. I think that if you're the Nets, to me, it's just been screaming in my face this whole time. Why wouldn't you want to try and regain control of your assets to be able to have at least a brief window, right? Of okay, maybe you're only bad for a year or two, right? But hell, with the Cooper Flag draft right around the corner in 2025, like that's why I think a Nets trade for the Nets to be able to get back those assets makes so much sense to me. But I'm curious your thoughts on this perspective, because I think that's why there's leverage here from the Rockets is those Nets picks matter or have more intrinsic value to Brooklyn than to any other team in the association. And that's kind of where I land.
Yeah, this is always what Doug and I talk about. Having control of your own picks means you can dictate how you want to approach season over season. Why did the Nets try to end up still staying competitive this last year? And then, by the way, when it doesn't work out, you only have 32 wins, it looks even worse. But why did you come in saying, oh, we want to compete, making the playoffs is a part of our goal? It's because you don't have your own pick control. If not, you can make a lot of different choices. You look back at that Houston trade, obviously, even at the time. Now, it's hard to go back and wonder what if. I think the Nets organizationally looked at Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson from the Kevin Durant trade and said, hey, this represents why it's not so bleak to have a superstar leave and have another superstar leave and have another superstar leave. However, because you didn't have your own pick control, it prevented you from being open to pass-through trade offers, a team that's been rumored now with ties to Houston in the 9th overall pick in the Grizzlies. Supposedly, they were willing to open up the coffers to bring in Mikal Bridges, but you don't make that choice at the time because you're uncertain about having control over your own destiny. We've advocated that the Brooklyn Nets, it's not about not liking Mikal Bridges' game. It's about being miscast in Brooklyn as the 1 or 1A when he should be an elite 3 is the reality of probably where he should be in a hierarchy of a team. So rather than sit here and say, let's be average and muddle our way through for 2 or 3 more seasons and then start to look at Phoenix picks, which, by the way, are still beholden to whether or not they're good or bad and what choices they make for their roster going forward. Get control now. Be really bad right now. And then in 2025, it's almost kismet for Brooklyn if they chose to go this way. Tank now. Get in one of the deepest draft classes that we have seen in recent memory and find a way to bring in other core pieces with some guys that you like right now and just reset the clock. It does not look like they're going to do that, but every indication would suggest they should be doing that.
How much do you think pride is playing a factor in this, right? Because we've seen GMs who are, so they dig their heels in, right? How much do you think the idea of having a secondary trade with Houston where you basically almost concede defeat in the James Harden trade, where you're like, hey, we are, the James Harden trade blew up, or well, the big three kind of blew up in a spectacular fashion, right? There's like so many parallel universes where Kyrie Irving, James Harden, and Kevin Durant win like multiple titles together, or if KD's shoe size was like a little bit smaller, right? No toe on the line against like all these different alternate realities. But how much do you think it plays into the fact that like maybe Sean Marks is looking at this like I can't go and deal Bridges to Houston to get back our draft assets that we traded for James Harden in the first place?
Yeah, listen, I mean, there's always been like some saving grace around what's gone on for Brooklyn and for the GM Sean Marks because injuries, right? Kevin Durant, when you make the trade initially, he's still recovering. Then you have some injuries with Kyrie Minor. You have the insanity that was obviously an unprecedented era around basketball in the country, the world. So all of these things keep giving a little bit of cover where you go, well, if not for this random occurrence, sure. Even the Ben Simmons injuries are kind of, on the one hand, it's a knock on Sean Marks for saying, well, then why make the trade at all? You almost would have been better off to let James Harden walk outright into free agency than to take on the contract of Ben Simmons, which you're still a year away from getting out from underneath. I would say most GMs in his spot would feel a need to save face. And also, there's very few GMs in the league that are as Teflon as he is, that have as long a tenure that he has. He's going into the 3rd or 4th iteration of the Brooklyn Nets. From when he first came in, cleaned it up, had Kenny Atkinson, a plucky team with Spencer Dinwiddie, D'Angelo Russell, Jared Allen, makes the trade for James Harden. When you have these other options after you bring in superstars, that falls apart. Now you're in another pseudo rebuild, but you may still do a 2-year window where it's Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson and these kind of middle-of-the-road veterans. So I think that some of this does, but I also believe that with every passing season in any circumstance, it softens the blow of acknowledging that you made a mistake. So if Brooklyn sits here and says, yes, we got a haul for Kevin Durant and we should have just traded Mikal Bridges right then and there, we shouldn't have re-signed Cameron Johnson. Every year that it gets away from that is, I think, another step where you can say, and now we're going to pivot. Now we're going to make a new decision, and the fan base reacts a little bit softer. Although for Brooklyn, I will say this fan base has held on to, rightfully, the grudge of what GMs have chosen to do over the last decade
and how damaging it's been to the long-term future. Look no further than the finals right now, where we're recording obviously ahead of game one, but Kyrie Irving is there. That is a process of Brooklyn. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, the Boston Celtics, that's a process of Brooklyn and choices that they made years ago. So it's hard, man. It doesn't seem
so
like
what you're
Sean
saying
Marks
is in a way, regardless of who wins the finals, Celtics or Mavs, the Nets can have their own little mini parade because they sort of helped both of those teams out, right?
Listen, I don't know if they give one ring for the entire organization, a handful. I don't know. You send one to Billy King wherever he is now, right? But somebody deserves some credit here. At least the fan base deserves something. So yeah, it is an interesting set of circumstances.
Right back to the conversation with Jackson Gatlin after we tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. You know that you could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports all summer long. You can make Prize Picks lineups in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and you're locked in. Looking for promotions? Well, Prize Picks has got you covered each and every week, from lowering selected player stats projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chances to get a win, and also getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. That's today. Put in a lineup. You'll get your fees back if you lose. That's called great coverage. And you know that Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become a part of the Prize Picks community today. Oh, you know that if you want to go ahead and look over this weekend and say Jaylen Brown for more than 25 points, yeah, you could throw that in there with a mix of any number of Boston players. Maybe you go Luka on overmade three-pointers. Going to need that if they want to bounce back in the NBA Finals. You download the app today, use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Download Prize Picks today. Use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. It is, of course, Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
You mentioned that young core for the Houston Rockets. I always thought of them more in the mode of an OKC. Hey, you keep drafting, you have all this assets, you keep filling the pipeline, you wait until certain guys bubble up, and then all of a sudden you're a #1 seed in the Western Conference and you've turned this thing around. I'm fascinated, one, by the fact that Ime Udoka, who this is very rare in NBA basketball terms, that a coach is dictating the tempo of a franchise as opposed to, your elite core player that you believe in. I think it's probably the right move for them. But when you mention having 6 players 22 or younger, from Tari to Alperen to Jalen to Amin to Jabari and Cam, how many of those guys are viewed by the organization as foundational core pieces? Because I think Houston, in a lot of ways, they lucked out with Jalen Green and being accidentally maybe patient enough for him now to go from being, how do we dump this, poison pill, quote unquote, contract to, oh, maybe this guy's an important piece, or at a minimum, an important trade piece that can actually get you something back.
Yeah, I think if you would have asked me 6 months ago about the Rockets core 6, right, the glaring answer would have been, well, Jalen Green has really struggled. He had a really bad 2/3 of his third season here, this past campaign, and he was the guy that was being actively, shopped in trade talks and being discussed, and a lot of rumors about his future with the Houston Rockets, which was really tough to stomach, right? Because he was kind of the first domino in the Rockets rebuild. They got incredibly lucky in bottoming out that first year where they did have pick obligations owed to the OKC Thunder. They basically had a coin flip as to whether or not they would keep that top 4 selection. And then thankfully it landed top 4. They got the #2 overall pick and they were able to draft Jalen Green. Had it landed outside of the top 4, it would have gone to OKC. And that would have been a catastrophic start to the Rockets' attempt to rebuild and pivot from the James Harden era. But I do think when you look at the entirety of the young core, Alperen Sengun has cemented himself as the best of the 6 so far. He was borderline all-star this past, not even borderline. He played like an all-star this past season, just didn't get the nod from a voting perspective, a popularity perspective, whatever you want to call it. If the Rockets have won a few more games, I think maybe he's in the all-star game instead of somebody else. I don't know. Yep. But I think up and down the core, Jalen would have been the guy that you would have looked at and said, okay, he's probably the most likely to be traded as of 6 months ago. But then the way that he turned things around at the end of the season, and also I'll highlight here, Ime Udoka never wavered, right? Ime Udoka never lost sight of the forest for the trees. Like he knew what he was building and working on with Jalen. He remained patient with him throughout the season, throughout all the ups and downs in his play. And it's really tough to say that none of the core, or that everybody is untouchable when it comes to the core six. I think for the right deal, obviously you have to be willing to make a move, right? If a star player becomes available, what have you, then yeah, maybe Jabari is the one that's included, or maybe Jalen is on the way out if the right player becomes available. The difficulty here in this discussion is I don't think Mikal Bridges necessarily warrants parting ways with one of the young core six. I see Tari Eason thrown around in a lot of hypothetical trades, especially coming from the Nets side of things. And I think just this is like a league-wide thing. It's not just a Nets thing. It's not just a Brooklyn thing. But I feel like league-wide, Tari Eason is really undervalued. I know that internally, the Rockets probably value Tari Eason more than anybody else of the core six from a sheer like metrics perspective, their internal valuations, how he impacts winning at the highest level. Now, he is coming off of a season where he only played a handful of games. He basically was playing on a broken leg all year with this weird like tumor thing that he had. It's very strange. But when he does play, he's one of the most impactful players on the floor. So I can't see a world where the Rockets would be willing to part with him, especially because you can make a very legitimate argument here that in 1 or 2 years, Tari Eason might be a better player than Mikal Bridges is. Like, that's the tough thing to discuss, which is why I think when we get into these hypotheticals about if the Rockets were to deal with Brooklyn, I think we're more talking about just the draft asset side of things, right? Like how can the Nets get those picks back? And generally the hang up that I find, Adam, is that 2025 swap, right? That seems to be the tipping point in any of these potential deals where I see lots of Rockets fans who are like, yeah, give them back, give them the number 3 pick, give them 2027, hell, give them 2027. But nobody wants to give up that 2025 pick. That's like the crown jewel. And here's where I might get a lot of flack for this. Sure. I'm not as high on the idea of the 2025 draft as others are, mostly because I think the idea of coveting like the Peter Griffin, like Family Guy, like the mystery box, right? Like what it could be this, right? Like we could get a boat or we could get a mystery box because it could even be a boat. Like I can't do that because for a couple different reasons. One, we see what happened this past year. Nets were 11th in the Eastern Conference, and albeit it's a weak Eastern Conference, right? I think we can safely assume maybe some things go a little bit differently. Maybe the Nets have an even better record, next year, or they could have even played better than they did this current season, right? Maybe a little bit higher in the standings, what have you. That pick was supposed to be 9 in the lottery, right? The Rockets got incredibly lucky, pick jumps up. I don't like the idea of like trying to bank on the Nets' downfall, especially when it feels like Sean Marks and company have just dug their heels in and they are just fully committed to the idea of, hey, we like Mikal Bridges, we like Cam Johnson, we're going to try and lure and attract another star here. Because here's the thing is, even if that's not necessarily the right recipe for success in your eyes, my eyes, whatever, for building a long-term sustainable contender, what I could see Brooklyn doing is maybe taking all those Suns picks, right, and throwing them in a deal for a Donovan Mitchell type. And then suddenly a team with Donovan Mitchell, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, like that's a team that's going to be consistently at least top 6 in the Eastern Conference, probably fighting for a top 4 seed every year. And then suddenly the value of the Nets picks that the Rockets own they plummet, right? And then you're not talking about potentially having, all these lottery picks and all these top assets. I feel like a lot of Rockets fans are viewing the Nets picks as like this pile of gold of like, oh yeah, we're going to have top 3 picks every single year. And it's like, no, that's not the reality of the situation. All it takes is one rushed decision from Sean Marks and company to then tank the value of those picks. And if you don't capitalize on the value that you have right now, either by making a trade with the Nets or with another organization, then I think you're going to be really disappointed in what ultimately those picks could or could have become.
And that's what the irony is about it, right? Because Houston has control of the picks, and any team having control of your picks, it maybe inspires an organization to make more keep winning, keep competing, win now mode decisions. Whereas if you have your own picks, then you can, again, as we say, control your own destiny. So the irony that by not being willing to maybe give up the 2025 pick, let's say theoretically back to Brooklyn in a trade for Mikal Bridges in this instance, and we can talk a little bit more about whether or not I think that's realistic at any level. But by not giving it up, Brooklyn says, okay, fine, we're not going to make that deal. And by not making that deal, we're going to go ahead and make decisions that actively make us a more competitive team. Now, championship level, few and far between. They're going to have a lot of money to work with next summer once they get off of Ben Simmons' contract. So maybe they can outright sign somebody. That's great. But you mentioned, listen, top 6, top 5, whatever it is, if you're being competitive, middle of the pack NBA team, it removes the value off of those picks. And what I find fascinating right now is for how negatively 2024 is being looked at as a draft class. To your point, Well, 2025 is being looked at equally as impressive and equally as deep. And that's great. But we know that there's always misses, there's always hits. And I think maybe Doug and I sometimes disagree about having that pick in the draft is the prospect of what could be. Whereas when you look at players that have been in the league, we talk about some guys that are established. Well, if you're established, but you haven't really shown anything yet, that's not so favorable over a draft pick in a future draft class. And the few guys like a Jalen Green that finally show a little flash, well, now they get treated much, much differently by that organization. Now they say, yeah, okay, great. 2025 first round draft pick. I've got a player that is shown to be capable at the NBA level. And I think that makes a really big difference here when you get into these kind of negotiating waters. Now, that being said, let's anger up some of the Brooklyn Nets fans here because I have a visual aid. Jackson Gatlin is going out to the Houston Rockets.
I like that first we went. First, I had to upset Rockets fans by saying I'm not valuing the 2025 swap as much, and now you're going to anger the Nets fans. So here we go. Let's go.
That's the way we work it here. If you're over on YouTube, obviously you can see you put out this hypothetical, and you asked this about a Memphis Grizzlies trade as well. But you put up Houston Rockets getting Mikal Bridges and the Suns 2027 first round pick. Nets getting Dillon Brooks, their 2024 pick back, third overall, their 2025 pick back, and the 2026 pick back as well. Now, what's excluded there? The Houston Rockets 2025 pick, potentially, if we want to get into those waters. What's also interesting here, though, is the Dillon Brooks piece of it. Just briefly, why is Dillon Brooks? There's a salary match part of it. I get that. But is it effectively just that, is he just not viewed as being a part of what they want to do going forward? And we all know the history of Dillon Brooks. I'm not trying to put down his personality or otherwise, but it just does seem like for everything that Houston is building and trying to accomplish here, Dillon Brooks is like the easy, hey, you're making over $22 million. Let's get him out of here if we can. And obviously, you bring in a player in the process.
Yeah, so first off, just from a personality perspective, I will say Dillon Brooks is nothing like what I thought he was going to be. Like, I thought he was going to be one of the worst, like not like a bad, like toxic locker room president. I just thought he was not going to be like a nice dude. Right. He is one of the nicest guys I've ever interacted with as an NBA player. Like, he is so friendly, so down to earth. He really cares about giving back to the community, all that. Just want to say, like, Dillon Brooks, the human being, is an incredible person. Right. That said, Dillon Brooks, the player, I think he was on maybe his like best behavior for the first, half or 2/3 of the season. He wasn't doing a lot of the things that Rockets fans were worried about him doing when they first signed him from the Memphis Grizzlies. So we did see him kind of revert back to some of that like Memphis Grizzlies, Dillon Brooks a little bit near the end of the season, some ill-advised, shot taking, the defense maybe took a little bit of a slip near the end of the season, just some things that you could kind of see and project out. And you're like, man, we have him under contract for 3 more years. He's still still a high quality NBA player, a legit starting quality NBA 3-and-D wing, upper echelon defender. But I do think in a vacuum, right, like Mikal Bridges is clearly the better player when it comes to, versus Dillon Brooks. What I will say, though, is I do think he's a guy that, the salary matching is there, but that's not necessarily the issue because the Rockets do have other avenues of salary matching when it would come to potentially a Mikal Bridges trade. They could package any combination of Jayshawn Tate, Jock Landale, Jeff Green, hell, Steven Adams, although I think they project Steven Adams to be a big part of what they want to do next season, so I doubt he gets used as just salary filler. But all those contracts I just named are all effectively expiring deals, very team-friendly contracts that could just immediately come off the books or potentially be flipped down the line at the trade deadline to a team that wants some salary relief, that kind of thing. And then on the Dillon Brooks front, I do think he's a player that even if he doesn't have a long-term fit in Brooklyn necessarily, he's a guy that I think could very easily, you could flip him for additional value down the line, right? So he's used as filler in this trade, but then down the line, you could recoup maybe an additional future first or something from a team that actually wants his services on a contending team.
The hardest part about it for, I think, just from a Nets perspective is 3 years, right? Like whether or not he's flippable or movable, anything the Nets want to try to do. If it's not a young guy, then we want it to be a guy that's expiring, that's coming off the books at the end of this season, right? So that, as much as anything, if it was Dillon Brooks on a 1-year deal and the money was even a little bit heavier, I think the Nets might be interested in that type of situation, whether it's with Houston or another team. I was saying, hey, great, end of this season, it clears off the books and we're good. Now, the other thing you mentioned there is all of the salary matching that the Houston Rockets can do. There's other names, other players, but you didn't mention any of the young guys. So again, let's go back to the core of this. If it's about Mikal Bridges, what is the limit to how deep Houston would go into the young core 6 and include pick control back for the Brooklyn Nets? It doesn't mean, not every pick. We're talking about 24, get their 25 back, whatever it looks like. Is there an appetite from the Houston side to say, and we would maybe give you 24 and 25 and a player and 2 young players, knowing that maybe Brooklyn could also say, Dorian Finney-Smith, You think that he's a nice 3-and-D wing to add into this mix and have you compete now? Like, we can do some things on our side to give you veteran players that help move the needle.
See, the difficulty here is I largely do believe that the Rockets view the core six as untouchable unless there is a top four. Yeah, unless there is a true blue like top 20, top 15 guy. Like if you were talking in a potential like Donovan Mitchell trade, then yeah, I think suddenly some of those names are maybe getting dangled, right? Like if they think they can get their hands on Donovan Mitchell and if they think that he would want to be a fixture in Houston long term and not immediately bolt after next season, then yeah, I think maybe you're talking about including one of the young names. But for a guy like Mikal Bridges, who is an upgrade over Dillon Brooks, absolutely, you're not going to give up on the future of those other young guys yet because they're not in that place where they're ready to strike as a true blue contender just yet. And on top of that, the Rockets do have access to their non-taxpayer MLE this offseason, which clocks in at just under $13 million. So they can add other win now pieces without necessarily having to do it via trade or without having to give up on any of these young guys yet. And that's the difficulty in this is I do think it all kind of boils down to how much the Nets truly value getting those picks back and whether or not that hang up is that 2025 pick. And I'm at a point where I would value the established player, so Mikal Bridges in this instance, I would value the established player who has proven himself to be an all-NBA capable defender. Clearly a guy that you said earlier, right, is miscast in his current role, but is a phenomenal kind of like third banana on a true contender, as illustrated previously when the Suns made their finals run, right, with Devin Booker and Chris Paul, and then Mikal Bridges kind of playing that third or even at times fourth banana, depending on, what kind of mood DeAndre Ayton was in that season.
The narratives we forget about, just a moment ago, things were so different across the NBA landscape.
Dude, for real. No, I mean, things can change at the drop of a hat. And that's the other important thing here to note is just that we're having this conversation right now, and maybe status quo doesn't change, right? Maybe the Rockets don't do anything. Maybe the Nets don't do anything. And we revisit this conversation at the next trade deadline, right? Midway through next season. And maybe things change drastically to where the Rockets feel very differently, where they're like, oh, no, now we really need to go back and get Mikal Bridges at all costs. Or maybe this next season starts and it's a disaster for the Nets, right? Maybe they have a bad injury from the jump, or they're not playing as well as they thought they could have. They're not able to make any major roster additions this offseason. And suddenly they're looking at things like, oh man, we're looking at like we're going to be one of the worst 5 teams in the association, and we're about to convey a potential top 5 pick to the Rockets. How do we get our hands back on that pick? So I think as it stands right now, it feels like a trade would benefit both sides, but I think it's everything that I've come to understand about this is that the Rockets have attempted and reattempted multiple times to engage the Nets in these discussions, and they're the ones who have basically said, no, like we're not feeling it, right? Like it takes 2 to make a trade happen, and the Rockets are trying to make something come to light with this Nets situation, but it feels like they are hell-bent on the path that they have chosen right now.
The irony that Mikal Bridges on the Houston Rockets, it's the same thing the Nets have a problem right now with Mikal Bridges on the Brooklyn Nets. You just need the better player ahead of him. Like you need the elite talent, established talent ahead of him, and not that Houston doesn't have far more established, even young talent in that regard. To your point, by all accounts, Houston is calling. They're stirring the pot. They're dialing it up. They're sending out the signals. And the Brooklyn Nets have been staunch in saying, Mikal Bridges is untouchable. We're not having these conversations about this. I find the picks interesting. Like, I find if the Brooklyn Nets gets a draft night and they think maybe there is a player at the top there, the 3rd overall pick, and they can get Houston to put 25 back in the mix, swapping X number of Phoenix picks to get back your own control, that's a pivot that I think Brooklyn should very much be open to, even if it doesn't include Mikal Bridges. Just have the straight conversation, and maybe Dorian Finney-Smith does become a sweetener for Houston or otherwise, right? So somewhere it feels like something needs to happen here, mostly for the Brooklyn Nets. I think the other reality for Nets fans here is that Houston would like to do something, but they don't need to do something. You mentioned, if it doesn't go well for Brooklyn, Houston goes, great. And now we have another top 5 pick potentially in next year's draft class that we can draft or we can use, trade, get a star, etc. It keeps coming back to the Brooklyn Nets are beholden to a lot of other outside forces, whereas Houston and a lot of other teams get to say, yeah, we're competing. We're playing hard. We have our core. Now we're just waiting to see if we get opportunities through some other teams' poor play to be more successful, to have better benefits going forward. So it's one of those really bad spots for us. I envy, as most Nets fans should, I envy the situation that we currently see Houston in, because they're in a really good spot to compete now and then still be able to build for later. The only maybe silver lining is it's the Western Conference, and you can be a really good team and then still not make the playoffs. So, Brooklyn is only a 37-win season away from being in the play-in tournament.
And what's funny is the Rockets were kind of it used the Rockets as like the blueprint, because the Rockets were very much in this position a few years ago in the aftermath of the Russell Westbrook Chris Paul trade, where they mortgaged their future, and the Rockets are still going to have to deal with the ramifications of that trade for the next few years as those picks are still owed to the OKC Thunder. But they had a brief window where they were like, all right, cool, we're going to be bad for a few years, and we're going to get back to a place where we're competitive to reduce the value of those picks that are owed to not necessarily like that wasn't their only reason for wanting to do it, but they had a blueprint, right? They lost their draft capital due to a bad trade, very similar to what happened with the Brooklyn Nets in what is now we can call a bad trade, or however you want to look at the hindsight 2020, whatever, of the aftermath of the James Harden trade. I think at the time it was the right move, right? You go all in, you give yourself a big three. The right move at the time. It just didn't play out the way anybody would have thought it would, or the best possible outcome, I should say. So now what do, right? You make that pivot like you were talking about earlier. You can make that pivot, and then the Nets, very realistically, if they were to make this trade, get back their draft assets, they could, in 2 to 3 years' time, be in the exact same position the Rockets are in right now, and possibly having these exact conversations with the Suns about trying to get their picks back, right? Yes. It's first-round picks all the way down, Adam.
Come on, baby. Jackson Gatlin, from his words to the Brooklyn Nets fan base, baby, we're just a couple of years away from making it all happen. Listen, I'm sure that we're going to have these kind of conversations getting towards the draft as well. Jackson Gatlin, who was in attendance last year, I don't know if we'll be meeting up again this time around, but it's interesting, man. And guess what? When you're not in the playoffs, these are the discussions you have. How do we get this team better? How do we improve ourselves? How do we make it so that next year, this time, we're talking about competing and trying to go to conference finals and trying to get a championship for either one of these fan bases? The prospect's a little bit dimmer for Brooklyn right now, but we shall see, man. Always a pleasure to connect with you. I will say we're going to clean up on the back end, but you know where to find us. Him there, me there. We're all over the place. It's Locked On, man. We're having a good time.
And that, my friends, is a great conversation with Jackson Gatlin from Locked On Rockets. As we said at the top, it's a reminder that just because, even in our version of things on Locked On Nets, where we think the rebuild is what Brooklyn should want to do, okay, how many picks would Houston give for Mikal Bridges in a trade like that? How many young players, maybe none, would they be willing to put in the mix for that? And ultimately, when we look at the NBA draft later this month, it does seem like, as we've talked about, whether or not we think you're always going to be able to find NBA talent in there, and there's going to be players that surprise in the 2024 draft, you certainly have to look at it and realize that a lot of teams, Houston included, looks at this opportunity to maybe leverage a little bit of extra value with the third overall pick and mitigate some of the risk that they had in trying to get the most out of some of these controlled Nets access. That being the case, we'll be back again next weekend. We'll keep talking about the NBA Finals, what's going on there, how some of these players in the draft could appeal to the Brooklyn Nets if they're able to make a trade that gets them back into the 2024 NBA Draft. And for all those things, get over to YouTube, turn on the subscribe, the alert buttons. By the way, we hit that 7K mark. Thank you to all of you. You now get to be a part of the journey towards 8K. And obviously, you follow us on X at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie, and at Locked On Nets. And as always, when there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote short of saying that I miss my friend. And I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.